What's up YouTube? It's the one and only Legend of Winning, aka Low, and I'm back with another video. So since the decade has come to a conclusion, in today's video I decided to go back and look over the past 10 years and discuss some of the biggest mistakes that have been made. The video title itself is pretty self-explanatory, so no real need to go into any deep details in the intro, so let's get right into it. In the middle of the 2015-2016 season, Rob Hennigan decided to move in a different direction, despite Tobias Harris coming off of a season in which he was a 17-point scorer while grabbing 6 rebounds, and decided to trade him to the Detroit Pistons, and in return received Brandon Jennings and Ersan Ilyasova. Now, the reason why this transaction was so questionable, even when it was transpiring, is because a little over a year ago, Jennings tore his Achilles, and in the process of him trying to go back to being the same productive player that he once was, he was falling short miserably. B, Jennings was also on an expiring contract, and by the end of the season, it was clear that he wasn't going to make his return back in Orlando. And C, even though Ersan Ilyasova did give them some veteran presence, which is something that Hennigan was looking for with this young team, the productivity that Ilyasova brought to this roster just wasn't even close in contrast to what Tobias Harris was providing. So in the 2016 offseason, Ersan Ilyasova, as well as their 2016 first-round pick, which turned out to be Sabonis, as well as Victor Oladipo, was traded to the Oklahoma City Thunder, and in return, the Orlando Magic received Serge Ibaka, who was on an expiring contract. The belief was that within Serge Ibaka's limited time in Orlando, they were going to be able to provide enough evidence to prove to him that he should sign back with the team, because Rob Hennigan believed that not only was Serge Ibaka the final piece that this team desperately needed to make them a winning organization, but also they were going to have the ability to compensate him financially. But unfortunately, all of that was overshadowed by the constant losing, and by the trading deadline in the 2016-2017 season, Serge Ibaka found himself playing for the Toronto Raptors after trade demands, and in return, Orlando received Terrence Ross. Yes, Terrence Ross. And what makes this decision even worse is that both Tobias Harris and Victor Oladipo have gone on and have continued to improve as individuals. So to have both of those players on your roster at one point and somehow basically turn both of them just into Terrence Ross, who is older than them and is also a bench player, is a bit ridiculous and a massive loss for the Orlando Magic. During the summer 2013, one of the more overlooked names was a free agent, and that player just so happens to be Josh Smith. Josh Smith spent his first 9 years in the NBA playing for the Atlanta Hawks, and in Atlanta, he was easily one of the more underrated players in the league. He was constantly putting up around 15 to 17 points, grabbing somewhere around 7 to 9 rebounds, a steal and a half, and a block and a half, some years closer to 2 blocks per game. But I digress. In the summer of 2013, Josh Smith was either looking for some type of financial compensation, either a max or a near max contract, or looking to be moved to the small forward position, which he felt was going to be a better fit for his build, which were demands that the Hawks were not willing to meet. So he went into free agency to figure out his value in the league, and there he found a 4-year, $54 million contract from the Detroit Pistons. Josh Smith would go on to play so bad in his first year and a half with the Pistons that Detroit had no other choice but to waive him from the team and stretch out his contract for the next 5 seasons. Josh Smith was waived from the team during the middle of the 2014-2015 season, and here we are entering the 2019-2020 season, and he is still owed $5.3 million. To put that number into context, last year Josh Smith earned more money than Derrick Rose, and this year he's going to make more money than some first-round picks in this past draft class, and that's to not play for the Pistons. Entering the 2016 offseason, many people were aware of the ridiculous amount of money that was being introduced into the NBA thanks to the new TV deal that the league signed. And with the new money that was going to be introduced into the league, that obviously meant that the salary cap was going to go up, and of course the money was going to be distributed to the players who were going to sign contracts in that offseason. Unfortunately, though, the decision was made to allow all of that money to be introduced into the salary cap all at once instead of just gradually increasing the salary cap over the course of 4 to 5 years. a mistake in and of itself that would allow the Golden State Warriors to sign Kevin Durant and build arguably the most talented team in league history. But that wasn't even the biggest mistake that was made. With the salary cap spiking to new heights, as well as many people assuming that the salary cap was going to continue to increase significantly over the next 3 to 4 years, it was very difficult to determine how players should be compensated financially. And because of these difficulties, let's just say many players got overpaid. You have the Portland Trail Blazers signing both Allen Crabbe and Evan Turner to 4-year, $70 million to $75 million contracts, Nicholas Batum to the Charlotte Hornets for 5 years, $120 million, Steven Adams receiving a 4-year, $100 million contract extension from the Oklahoma City Thunder, and finally Chandler Parsons, who has only played 95 games since he has signed this contract, inked his name next to a 4-year, $94 million contract. During the early 2010s, the Oklahoma City Thunder had a really good young core that featured Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, Serge Ibaka, and of course James Harden. Now, after the 2012 campaign came to a conclusion in which led them all the way to the NBA Finals, Sam Presti, who didn't really have to make a decision but took it upon himself to try to be a bit ahead of the curve and sat down with both Serge Ibaka and James Harden to discuss a contract extension. Serge Ibaka was prioritized over James Harden thanks to his defensive abilities, and with OKC already having two primary scorers in both Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant. And also at the time, James Harden was a bench player, so the role that James Harden has now is nowhere near close to what he once had in OKC. But nevertheless though, James Harden's representatives and the Oklahoma City Thunder front office could not get on the same page on how Harden should be compensated. So because of the disagreement, Harden found himself on the chopping block and eventually traded to the Houston Rockets. And in return, there were some pieces that were gained for OKC, most noteworthy being Kevin Martin, as well as a draft pick that would eventually turn into Steven Adams. But as we all know, James Harden has really taken off within the last 4 to 5 years, so much so that he has turned into one of the greatest players I've ever witnessed in my entire lifetime, especially on the offensive end. He has won an MVP. Some people would argue, including myself, that he should have more than one, but at least he is indeed an MVP recipient in this league, and he has led the Rockets to multiple postseason appearances. But wait, it gets worse. As time has continued to pass us by, James Harden's true potential is not the only thing that has been revealed. As many of us are now aware, the hang-up between OKC and Harden's representatives was literally just $4 million. But wait, it gets worse. Because in the following years after losing James Harden, it became extremely clear that OKC needed that level of productivity, not only coming off of the bench, but also spacing out the floor. Productivity that I would argue really held them back from achieving the goal of winning a championship, especially in the 2016 offseason, in which the Oklahoma City Thunder were up 3-1 against the Golden State Warriors, but eventually dropped the ball in 3 straight games and eventually losing to the Warriors in 7. But wait, it still somehow gets worse. A few months down the line, the Thunder would eventually lose Kevin Durant due to free agency to the Golden State Warriors, and after a year of the Russell Westbrook show, they decided to regroup and add 2 players to the team in Paul George and Carmelo Anthony that would not only put them over the cap, but dip them way deep into the luxury tax. Mind you, the whole reason why they did not want to pay James Harden his money is because of $4 million. But more importantly, the team was still underachieving, and by the end of the 2019 season, the Thunder were forced to hit the restart button, and in the process of doing so, they ironically sent Russell Westbrook now to the Houston Rockets to team up with James Harden in Houston. And here we are now at the end of the decade, and a team that was built to dominate the next 10 years now has little to nothing hitting the restart button, despite at one point having 3 former MVPs on their roster. In the beginning of the 2010s, the once known New Jersey Nets were looking to rebrand themselves, and in that rebranding, they were also going to relocate to Brooklyn. Now, as most organizations do, when you're relocating to a new city, they decide to start fresh and bring in some new pieces in hopes to one day compete for a championship, and that is exactly the type of pressure that was laid upon the shoulders of general manager Billy King. And unfortunately, he failed miserably, so much so that some of the transactions that would transpire after the relocation, many people would argue are some of the worst in NBA history, especially when people were trying to label what would eventually become the 2014 Nets as a quote-unquote super team. So how exactly did we get to this quote unquote super team? Well, first it begins in the trading deadline of 2011 as the Nets decided to go after a disgruntled star in Deron Williams, and in return the Utah Jazz received Derek Favors, who at the time was in the middle of his rookie season and was the 3rd overall pick in the 2010 draft, Devin Harris, cash, and 2 first-rounders, one of which was the 2011 first-round pick that eventually turned out to be Enes Kanter, who was selected 3rd overall. Fast forward a year later, and the Nets were looking for a forward, so they decided to acquire Gerald Wallace from the Portland Trail Blazers. And in return, the Blazers would receive Mehmet Okur, Shane Williams, and a 2012 first-round pick that was unprotected. That pick would turn out to be the 6th overall pick, in which the Blazers utilized to select Damian Lillard. Now fast forward to the summer of 2012, and in an attempt to acquire another scorer on the perimeter, the Nets decided to acquire Joe Johnson from the Atlanta Hawks. Now, what they gave up really wasn't that big of a deal. A few miscellaneous pieces such as Deshaun Stevenson, Jordan Williams, and a 2013 first-round pick, but that just turned out to be Shane Larkin, so no massive pieces missed in that transaction. However, what was problematic was the amount of money that was going to be spent on Joe Johnson, as he was in the middle of a 6-year, $120+ million contract. And Joe Johnson was over the age of 30. So again, very problematic. But of course, we have to highlight possibly the most infamous transaction, not only of the decade, but possibly in the last 20 to 30 years. And that transaction was between the Nets and the Celtics. And the Celtics would receive a handful of players, no noteworthy ones, except for Gerald Wallace, who had underperformed so greatly in his short time with the Nets that it was undeniable that he needed to be traded as soon as possible. But the one thing that many people talk about this transaction is the ridiculous amount of draft picks that the Celtics received. The Nets would also give up a 2014 first-round pick that turned out to be James Young, a 2016 first-round pick that turned out to be Jaylen Brown, who was selected 3rd overall during that draft, the rights to swap a 2017 first-round pick, and the Nets in 2017 performed so poorly that they had the 1st overall pick during that draft. That pick would eventually turn into Markelle Fultz, but before that, the Boston Celtics would trade down during the 2017 draft to select Jason Tatum with the 3rd overall pick, and then finally a 2018 first-round pick, which was the 8th overall selection, and it was utilized to pick Colin Sexton by the Cleveland Cavaliers, as the Boston Celtics would eventually trade that pick to acquire Kyrie Irving. So yeah, the Boston Celtics came out looking pretty good during that transaction. However, it would get worse for the Brooklyn Nets, because in return, the Nets would receive a 37-year-old Kevin Garnett, who would play a grand total of 96 games with the organization, a 36-year-old Paul Pierce, who would play a grand total of 75 games for the organization, and a 36-year-old Jason Terry, who would play a grand total of 35 games, starting none of them. And to make matters even worse, it's not as if the Nets would eventually turn into this championship contending team. No, the Nets at best were a 44-49 win franchise that struggled to get out of the first round, and if they did, they were almost immediately eliminated in the second round.